Okay, the keynote ran over, so I want to get to a rolling start. My name is Andrew Shikyar. I lead marketing here at FIDO Alliance. I asked the early attendees in this track before, how many of you attended the authentication track yesterday? Okay, so yesterday gave a good feel for core authentication topics, including work from FIDO, W3C, as well as relationship to federation, ID proofing, and other related topics. Today's part of the authentication track, so new moves in authentication, is focused further on practical applications for FIDO and other modern authentication technologies. First, we'll hear from Brett McDowell to talk about modern authentication for modern governments. Of course, authentication is nothing new for governments, but what is new is the new range of threats and also a host of emerging regulatory policies and best practices that are needed to address these challenges. After that, we'll get into a panel from early adopters of strong authentication systems using FIDO and other technologies, and we'll finish up with a discussion on the state of biometrics. So key trends, initiatives, and challenges from three companies that are right in the heart of the biometrics space. So with that, let me turn things over to Brett McDowell. Brett's the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance and is going to talk to you about modern authentication for modern governments. Brett.
Thank you, Andrew. So every year for the past 4 years, I've given a talk about authentication at Cloud Identity Summit. And this year, I wanted to bring something to the summit that is a little new, because one of the things that I've been spending my time doing is traveling around the world talking to different governments about what they're doing with identity. And even though governments play by a slightly different set of rules than the rest of us, I think it's interesting to see what they're doing and why, and just to learn from it and then apply that to what you're doing in your enterprise. So let me start by talking about what do I mean by old authentication, so I can differentiate that from modern authentication. So passwords, one-time passcodes, and smart cards. Again, looking at this question from a government's perspective, these are their options. And OTPs either by SMS or hard token, and several of them have very different opinions about those two options. Let's look at them one at a time about why the old needs to be replaced with the new. So passwords, the problem here is data breach, password theft, and replay attacks. So over 80% of all data breaches, which is the worst stat in the history of the identity theft or the data breach research report from Verizon, this is the worst it's ever been, is last year. And the 65% increase in phishing attacks from the Anti-Phishing Working Group, which I believe is the highest increase they've ever seen in 1 year, and over 1,000 data breaches from the Identity Theft Resource Center, which is the most they've ever seen in any 1 year. So this problem is bad, but getting worse, and getting worse quickly. And in addition to the security and fraud side of the password problem, they're also difficult to use. So users don't like them, and they often forget them, and they're expensive to deal with the password resets. So let's look at one-time passcodes. And what's the problem with one-time passcodes that people are trying to modernize away from? Well, SMS reliability, which really means two things now. It means, can you trust that signaling protocol at all? Can you trust that the phone number hasn't been moved by a fraudster to their SIM card through simple KBA challenges with the mobile network operator? And can you actually deliver the code if they don't have a signal to receive it? And then the token necklace problem, because OTPs from a hard token are still bound to the one application that you can use them with, so you have to use one for each application. And then just the poor user experience. Again, where this is made optional, people do not opt for it very often. And the worst part of the one-time passcode problem is that these are still subject to automated attacks. And these automated attacks are real and in the wild and happening all the time. It's becoming fairly trivial to get a kit to go after any given application that will just collect the OTP and automatically forward it to the real login screen just as easily as it is to fish for a password. Now, smart cards. What's wrong with smart cards that governments are looking at? Well, they're expensive because unlike other authentication mechanisms, you actually have to buy this thing and give it to your end user. The second part is that they're inconvenient, and where that is really borne out is in the BYOD environment. Basically, this form factor doesn't play nicely with modern devices. So you can't use your smart card to talk to your smartphone. So smart cards aren't as smart as they used to be. But what's good about smart cards, and I'll build on this, one attribute they have is that their credentials are not subject to phishing. They're using PKI, but the problem with the PKI that they're using is you need a CA, you need all this overhead and infrastructure. So it'd be nice if we could use the public key crypto underneath without all the overhead and in a way that works nicely with modern devices. So now that brings me to modern authentication. So the first part that I'd focus on, what's happening with consumer devices? Like the smart card, which has secure storage on chip, modern devices have secure storage on chip. In a smartphone, that's something from the trusted execution environment. Apple calls theirs the secure enclave. You may have heard of that terminology. And then for the most secure storage, there's a secure element in addition to the TEE, which is a restricted software environment. And on PCs, you see that with trusted platform modules or TPM chips. These are commonplace now. All modern devices have this environment within the environment where not every app gets to access this memory, not every app gets to use this storage, only privileged applications get to. And this mitigates whatever you're storing there from being accessed with malware, which was the benefit of having your secrets on that secure chip in a smart card. So now we have that security benefit in the modern consumer device for a BYOD deployment scheme. Now, the other part about modern authentication, not only is it using secure storage and secure memory to save whatever secrets are stored there from being attacked with by malware, but they also have better user interfaces. So the modern authentication system is using biometrics instead of long passwords. And the modern authentication systems, well, you have a diversity of biometric solutions. So not just fingerprint, also iris. We have iris authenticators in the new Galaxy phones and some Fujitsu phones. That's becoming more commonplace. And all of this is backed by the secure storage in the device. And so when I get to the first example of modern authentication, which is FIDO standards and protocols, which you may have heard more about from Alex Simons this morning in his keynote, this combines the new usability advances of modern authentication using biometrics and those secure elements and secure memory components that are in all modern devices to give you better security than any of the old authentication mechanisms, better usability, and at a much lower cost point because the capability is already there. You, as an application provider, do not need to provision this capability to your users, unlike a smart card or a hard token. It's just there, it's on the device, you just have to turn it on and let them use it. So that's what makes it more usable and a better deployment strategy, and this is what gets governments excited. But they also come back to security, and they tend to have things like levels of assurance that they're looking for. So when they're looking at enterprise use cases in particular, they already have a lot of rules that has to be on the high side of the level of assurance schemes. So how does this deliver on security? So it's based on public key cryptography. It is public key cryptography. So you've got the private secret that's stored on the device, and it's never given away. So you cannot be phished or socially engineered for your secret, unlike passwords and one-time passcodes. So that's a security benefit that takes the main attack vector for data breaches off the table a priori. The key stays on the device, and it's bound to the device using modern secure technology, the same security that governments are already familiar with through smart card deployments. There's no secret on the server, so if there is a data breach, there is no risk of a replay attack from those harvested credential databases, because the only thing that's stored there, it would be a public key. There's no third party in the protocol. This is point to point. You can then federate from that first authentication point if you want to have federation, or you can just deploy this separately. You're not dependent on partners deploying the technology. Biometrics, if they're used, must stay on the device. This is also an element of the FIDO example, and I'm going to show a counter example in a moment. But the thing to keep in mind with FIDO technology, the biometric template never leaves the device. It is, in fact, stored and protected with the same high level of secure components that those private keys are stored and protected with. And there's no linkability. So there's no global unique identifier on these devices. So there's no way to track the user across activities, or at least there's no new way to track the user. So all the old tracking schemes are in place, but FIDO gives you nothing new to track users with. So now let's look at some counterexamples and look at some government programs around the world. Let's start with India. I feature India for a couple of reasons. A senior economist at the World Bank declared that this Aadhaar program in India is the most sophisticated, innovative identity system being deployed in the world today. So let's look at what they're doing. Aadhaar is essentially a number. So this is a national ID program. Every citizen gets a number. So the one thing to keep in mind is that Aadhaar is actually about the number, not about these other aspects, these other characteristics. That number gets bound to the user with kind of traditional, old match-on-server authentication, biometric authentication, which means, unlike the FIDO example, this is a counterexample where the template that is recorded, the fingerprint, in this case, they do fingerprint and iris. They also take a photo and they collect demographic information. And they offer a one-time passcode for those cases where you're on a device that doesn't have a biometric sensor. You're somewhere where they don't yet have the biometric readers that are part of the program. So they do have a fallback, and a fallback is to one-time passcode. Unfortunately, they position the one-time passcode as proof of possession of the device that got registered, a what you have authentication factor. And what we know now is that over the past few years, OTPs have been successfully phished remotely, meaning they're really not much of a proof that it is what you have anymore. Because there's the binding between that one-time passcode seed on your device and your device is not strong, because it can be intercepted on the wire and played back by an attacker. So in this system, they're collecting biometrics, they're binding to a number, they have tremendous government support. So this would be like your enterprise, where you get to decide what to do. You can say, all employees must do X, Y, Z. Well, in India, they have done that. And they now have almost 1.2 billion citizens enrolled. So over 1.1 billion enrolled with biometrics and provisioned with a number, and they have provisioning stations all around the country, and that is 99% of the population. So it is by far the largest biometric scheme ever deployed, and other governments are looking at it. Indonesia, I understand, is looking closely at this model and maybe replicating it. So what do we want to learn from this? You know, when we look at, all right, what can we learn from what India is doing when we try to decide how we want to run modern authentication? Well, here's another data point. In the US, there was also a database of biometric assets, not just templates, but actual biometric samples. This is the Office of Personnel and Management, one of the US agencies that stores information about personnel, especially personnel who are going after high security clearance. So this is a very valuable population, and because it's a valuable population, it's a valuable target. It's an easy target in terms of easy to identify, and unfortunately, it was also easy to crack. They had 2 data breaches, and they coughed up over 22 million biometric sets on highly valued US government personnel. So what can you learn from this? Well, as a recent CSO article covered, this is a cautionary tale of building giant databases of credentials. As if we didn't learn enough by building databases of passwords, which we really had no choice to do, and all the data breaches that have happened there, and all of the increased fraud and increased loss and increased attacks that have happened as a result. You want to keep that in mind when you're building these central databases of biometric templates, especially since there are alternatives in modern authentication to use where you can keep that biometric user experience, but without taking on the risk of trying to protect a database full of biometrics. Now let's look at another modern deployment, recent deployment of a government identity system. Let's look at the UK. So a couple of data points here. First, the UK has deployed a service. They wanted to get more of their citizens logging in to government applications. But instead of a national ID program, which they tried in years prior and failed miserably from a political perspective, so they, like the US and the Real ID Act, in the UK, the political tone was, hell no, no national ID program. So instead of doing that, to credential the users, they decided we'll trust the private sector credentials that our citizens already have. But of course, we have to put them through some rules and some tests. So this is federation, and this is relying on the private sector to do the credentialing, to do the KYC, and then you can just federate into the applications from the government. And they are using modern authentication with FIDO. They're using modern federation with SAML. And they are off to a pretty good start. So this is an example of a completely different model from what we saw in India. This is also modern, it's also new, it's recent, but they've taken a different approach. Not only are they not keeping a central database of biometrics, they're not running a national ID central database at all. So they're deferring to the private sector. So this is another example to learn from. But in addition to that, they published a 5-year national cybersecurity strategy late last year in which they actually name FIDO authentication as a best practice. So we're going to invest in technologies like trusted platform modules, which I mentioned, that's the security that's on the device there where you want to store your secrets, and emerging industry standards such as fast identity online, which do not rely on passwords for user authentication, but use the machine and other devices in the user's possession to authenticate. So there seems to be the beginning of a trend. So modern authentication is also regulated by these governments. Strong authentication is regulated. So there are a few examples, and I'm going to have to go through these rather quickly. In the US, here's a policy change. Both NIST and the Office of Management and Budget changed their mind on how to define multi-factor authentication. This is an important takeaway for any enterprise. The former requirements were that the 2 factors of authentication had to come from 2 separate devices. Well, they've changed that to remove that requirement, and also in Europe. So you've got the US changing that requirement in US regulation, you've got Europe changing that requirement in European regulation, so that now what they're doing instead is saying, look for that modern technology, that modern security technology, like a restricted execution environment. If both of the authentication factors are protected by a restricted execution environment, then both of those authentication factors count for multi-factor authentication, because we have mitigated the risk that we had the old rules to mitigate in the world of shared secrets. Because of this, you can have a multi-factor authentication event from a single gesture on a modern device. So imagine one biometric challenge for the user. So you touch a sensor or look at a sensor, and that gives you a what you are authentication factor. That unlocks the public key signing of the challenge, which proves possession of the device a what you have authentication factor. And unlike one-time passcodes, the binding is very strong. That private key cannot leave the device. So you actually can rely upon that as a what you have. So you get a what you have and a what you are, and you get away from what you know authentication factors, which are so porous. Basically, the shared secrets aren't very secret anymore. Another example is eIDAS. This is federation again. And the point here is that this is a pan-European effort so that identities in one country, whatever their national scheme is, can interoperate with identity schemes in other countries. And one of the problems they have is that different technologies, everyone has to reanalyze, does this technology meet my needs? And so they're looking for open standards, again, like FIDO, could fit that bill for them, where, okay, we can all use this one standard, we understand the technology, and now we can just require that for the various levels of assurance that we need. And again, in Taiwan, so something new here, Taiwan had the Financial Supervisory Commission already regulating multi-factor authentication, and again, they had this, they actually were kind of advanced. Like India, Taiwan was embracing biometrics. And their first approach was the same as India's approach, match-on-server biometric authentication, where the application was required by regulation to be verified, to verify the biometric themselves, which means you have to collect the template, you have to bring it up to the cloud, and you have to compare it, and you have to determine yourself whether there's a match. You're responsible for the match. They actually attended a few FIDO seminars and have changed their policy. So the new policy, which took effect late last year, is that you have to verify the biometric characteristics directly or indirectly. And that was to open the door for things like FIDO authentication, where they can now trust the device to do the matching and just trust the assertion from the device that the match happened and the match was successful. They no longer have to do it server side, which takes away that risk, like that happened to the Office of Personnel and Management in their data breach. And in South Korea, kind of going on a world tour here, they were using modern authentication, PKI. So they weren't really focused on biometrics, they were focused on PKI. Well, they were kind of an early adopter. So their regulation actually required ActiveX controls for handling the certificates. So IE and ActiveX controls. So they changed their rules around the same time FIDO was coming into being, and companies like Samsung were on the board of the FIDO Alliance. And so they got kind of excited. And now, because government regulated authentication for commerce is mainstream in Korea, and they have e-signature laws that are mainstream and used for banking and financial transactions all the time, and that this is not new, this is old. What's new is the new techniques used for it. So we're seeing an explosion of shift away from the ActiveX controls and IE to modern and mobile using FIDO standards. In fact, what the Korea FIDO Forum, which is an independent organization that we partner with, is reporting to us is that 70 out of 200 financial institutions that are subject to this regulation have plans to deploy FIDO in the next year. So what can we conclude? The market is seeing a lot of innovation. So we have a lot of new things coming in modern authentication. Industry standards, products, services. We're getting ubiquitous support on the modern devices for both the secure components that can protect the secrets, as well as better and better performing biometrics for improved user experience. So don't make your plans looking at old authentication, make your plans looking at new authentication. The other thing to look at is cost. Old authentication not only delivers less security, is more vulnerable to exploitation, but it's also more expensive to deploy. So this is a win-win for you of bringing back a, hey, let's modernize business proposition to your enterprise, because you're going to lower costs, especially over time, as you're not buying these tokens and issuing them to employees. And it gives you a better opportunity to balance security and usability if you're a consumer-facing service, and especially if you're a regulated environment like healthcare or financial services, because now you can meet multi-factor authentication requirements, but giving the best possible user experience of just a single gesture. So keep all of this in mind and looking at lessons you can learn, both lessons learned and best practices from what governments are doing, and apply that to your own enterprise. And I know that we just have like 1 minute before we have to start transitioning. Are there any quick questions?
It's interesting because I'll say I've been looking at government examples, and what you're saying makes perfect sense, I think, for the enterprise use case where you can deploy this to employees. But like to take the contrast, I'll say India versus UK. After 6 years now, UK has a little bit over 1 million people signed up, and the marketplace, they basically had to jumpstart it and fund it directly. So for right now, it's expensive because these aren't credentials people initially had. They were registering to sort of build up that critical mass. And I'm kind of curious, selfishly looking at the US market, if you were to look at these kind of examples and to look for things like things people already have and have these levels of trust, like I've heard, financial institutions brought up multiple times in multiple examples, like where do you sort of see that fitting in the US?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it brings up a point I haven't made. In the UK, the government was going to let private sector do the credentialing and the identity verification, but to a set of government-defined processes. And those processes did not line up well with what the commercial sector was already doing for their own businesses. Therefore, they had to force them to change, and therefore they had to pay them to change. And so, unlike most of these programs I've looked at, the UK actually offered this as a paid service to the government. That made it expensive for them to deploy. What's happening is, in the private sector now, is they are already moving to these authentication technologies. So you're already getting the high assurance levels without asking the private sector to do anything different. So I would say look very carefully at your identity vetting requirements and look for private sector partners where you don't have to ask them to change their business processes. Because if you're going to ask them to do that, you're going to have to basically pay them to do that. But if you're basically saying, make your service more sticky by letting people single sign-on into government services, and you don't have to change anything because my requirements match what you're already doing for your own business, I think that's your home run.
Time for one more question.
Okay, one more question.
So great to see the progress, and it's clear to me that the authentication has become more decentralized, and it's better, as several of your slides showed, for privacy reasons and security reasons. However, there's one aspect of it that I think is missing, which is the ability of making sure that a particular level of authentication has been used. And there are mechanisms to do that, but in my mind, it feels that you implicitly trust the device. And I know that FIDO has a way to certify the vendors and the specific devices, but it feels that those mechanisms could be circumvented. I'm very happy with the progress, especially outside the US and worldwide, but could this shortcoming become a problem in the future?
I think that if you simply require certification to a certain level, the good news, again, is the private sector is already doing that to themselves. So we are rolling out a security level-based certification, which will be live in the next 60 to 90 days. So you'll be able to say, no, we need level 2, we need level 3, FIDO certification, and then you're done. You can trust those in terms of circumventing those claims. Those are not just self-asserted. The certification authority, in this case FIDO Alliance, signs the metadata that's in the public registry for that device. So there is a root of trust to whether the certification is still valid. But it's in the absence of that, you would be needing to cover that gap yourselves. Great question. So thank you all for your time. I think we need to move to the next session.